Wrestling fans, promoters, wrestlers, and anyone who enjoys pro wrestling now have something new to be excited about. The Wrestling Fans International Association, the WFIA, is back. WFIA is an association that exists to promote, grow, and support professional wrestling throughout the world. Membership is free. Your membership includes a free digital bi-monthly publication of the Wrestling Fan News newsletter, association updates, voting privileges, and much more. Please go to thewfia.org, that's THEWFIA.org, and become a member today.
Everybody to the PWZ. This is Rick Del Santo. I've got a good friend of the show here today, David Harold, all the way from the UK. I want to say thank you for joining me this weekend. We're here to talk some professional wrestling.
That pleasure's all mine, sir.
Yeah. So there's a lot that goes on. There's a lot of wrestling. There's probably more wrestling today than there was growing up in the 1980s. What era did you grow up through?
So I got into wrestling around 94.
Okay.
So I very much the height of the new generation era. But wrestling VHS tapes in the UK from early as 85, 86 were so popular in the high street when VHS cassettes were available to buy. I would try and, we'd go to sales at a weekend, and I'd try and buy as many as possible, because as much as I enjoyed what the current product was at the time, even as a child, I was obsessed with the history of wrestling, so I tried to absorb as much as possible. So, but yeah, growing up in 94, it was the height of Bret Hart's popularity as WWE champion. I remember my dad telling me that you need to go to your grandparents right now and watch Nitro on TNT. We had TNT over here, but it was a very...
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was part of the Cartoon Network. So the Cartoon Network would finish at 7 p.m. our time, and then TNT would begin. And I said, why have I got to do this? We're going now, get ready. I had no idea where this was leading. And then Nitro was on, and Hulk Hogan, flashing forward to 96 here, Hulk Hogan walked out wearing black. And as a child, I was like, what the hell's going on? What is all this? And then I saw the footage of when he made the turn for the NWO. And it was unbelievable. I remember going to school and telling friends, Hulk Hogan's turned bad guy. Nobody believed me, because nobody did, but probably my happiest times as a fan were from 94 to around 2000. I was a WWE guy through and through. I was such a WCW fan. So when they did fold, as a fan, the business has never been the same since.
I'm going to agree with you on something. I was a WCW fan, NWA, like whatever you want to call it, at the time, the Crockett Promotions, which eventually turned into WCW through Turner. I, of course, started watching WWF in probably 1984. And it was probably a year into me discovering professional wrestling that I started reaching out, finding the AWA, World Class, Memphis, and then, but it was something about, once I discovered like all those other promotions and Jim Crockett Promotions, the NWA, whatever, it spoke to me for some reason. It was more realistic. There was no cartoons. There was just something about it. And that became my favorite company all the way up until it closed. And as heartbreaking as it was from, say, 99 forward till they closed, I was still a fan. I still watched it each week. And it was heartbreaking to watch, to be honest with you, the way the company turned after, when I don't want to entirely say Vince Russo took over, but
Yeah.
so it was definitely and I agree with you about the wrestling has not been the same whatsoever since I think wrestling is very good right now. I don't watch everything. I'm not the world's biggest AEW fan. I watch it on occasion. I keep up on everything really much from reading mostly, not necessarily watching as much.
Well, over here in the UK, obviously it was the Monday Night Wars in the States, but we had Raw and Nitro on a Friday night over here. So dubbed the unofficial Friday Night Wars. So on Sky Sport, Raw, and then on Bravo, you had WCW. Now, as you know, as we're getting deep into the Monday Night Wars, obviously WWE, the eventual winners. But I remember watching WCW, and it was that fateful night when Tony Schiavone said Mick Foley's going to win the championship. That'll put butts in the seats. You know, it's been documented to the end of time. I didn't switch the channel because I was not a Foley fan.
Really?
And if I'm honest, I've never been the biggest. His ECW stuff, I still think to this day stands up as some of the greatest character promo work of all time.
Yeah.
But because I'm a fan of WCW and I was such a fan of the Horsemen, I didn't flip the channel. I stayed with Nitro. It was only when I finished that episode of Nitro, even as the hardcore WCW fan as I was, I remember at the time thinking, maybe I should have switched the channel because that finger poke of doom for me. Everyone's got the theories about when WCW, the crack started to form. As a fan, that was the night for me.
Okay,
because,
that's understandable. Yeah,
we'd had the NWO shoved down our throats for 3 years prior to that, and I thought maybe we're going to get something because Hogan and Nash was a money match at the time. We hadn't seen it, and they were giving away free on Nitro. So I was like, this is fantastic. Something big's going down. And then obviously a few seconds later, what happened, and it just never felt the same for me at that. But I stuck with WCW, like you said, like yourself, right through to the death. And they came over to the UK a bunch of times. I never got to see them live, and it's one of my biggest regrets as a wrestling fan. Never got to see WCW live.
I grew up in Connecticut, which is, of course, WWF territory, WWE territory. I'm less than an hour away from the headquarters. I actually just drove by it Friday evening because we went to my buddy and I went to Victory Road for the Impact show, and yeah, it was a really fun show, honestly, and I got front row center, so I was in front of the hard cam the entire time. It was pretty exciting. Tommy Dreamer stole my water. We'll just say that. So I just got to point that out. But there will be a full review for anybody that's listening. I'm going to be doing the whole weekend because I got friends that are at the 1000 taping as well. So, but that's besides the point. We're talking here to talk to David. But with I felt like Impact tried to fill the void, and I thought that it's their approach, or TNA, excuse me, at the time, their approach was very interesting. I guess innovative for the time. If you think about it, like the weekly pay-per-views, which eventually turned into, I think they had a short deal with Fox Sports, which bombed terribly. And I thought that they gave a lot of people that a lot of work, honestly, that were out of work because WWE, excuse me, couldn't hire every single wrestler that came from WCW. WCW tried to hire every single professional wrestler that had some sort of recognition on the scene, it seemed.
Of course. No, I mean, at that time when WCW and ECW folded, the tape trading scene over here in the UK was as big as it's ever been. So when the NWA there was a couple of guys in the UK who were shipping tapes all over Europe. I remember picking up one of the early TNA week tapings, and like you said, it was different. You know, I was a huge Jeff Jarrett fan, so seeing Jeff every week on TV was great for me. I'd known of AJ Styles and Low Key for about a year before that because being a tape trader, I was collecting a lot of NWA side tapes. NWA
Me too. Yeah. I loved Wildside. That was my favorite promotion at one point, was NWA Wildside, because being an NWA fan, like, I've loved every iteration that they've been, you know what I mean? Up to, even today, you know what I mean?
No, I agree. The Wildside, I remember I took a chance and got a tape because Sabu was on the tape. Sabu fan, so I thought, what the hell, I'll try this. And this is when I was introduced to the likes of, I mean, some of these names: AJ Styles, David Young, Adam Jacobs, Frank Paris, Laz. I mean, the list goes on and on. I was hooked because I loved the studio style setting. It took me Rockets, Memphis and such. And having Bill Berens on the camera as well, I always thought the guy was a riot, and I've been very lucky to be able to talk to him over the years and get information from him on research. So Wildside was huge. So when a lot of their guys went to TNA, it became a double. So the tape trader I would get, it would always be almost a double order. I'd get the latest Wildside, and then I'd get the latest TNA, and then later on I'd get all the Ring of Honor tapes. So it as you said, it definitely filled some sort of gap that as fans we badly needed.
Yeah, absolutely. You were talking WCW before, and so like I said, growing up in WWE territory, WCW only came to Connecticut 2 times as right. WCW. Well, maybe 4, I should say. It's kind of weird how to say it, because during their hot streak, they came to Hartford, Connecticut twice. And then one was probably one of the worst nitros I've ever seen was with the Ultimate Warrior's debut. And then there was, of course, there was a house show that I attended probably, I want to say 1995, which I ended up having front row for. There was also, they ran New Haven 2 times in 1989 during the, I guess, Steamboat Flair era when Sting was television champion as well. I did not get a chance to go to those for whatever reason. The later period, I was able to go that I was driving. I was somewhat of an adult. I was a late teen, but during 1989, my parents wouldn't take me to anything that wasn't WWF because they didn't understand how awesome I guess 1989 WCW, NWA, WCW was, and
yes.
And they would only take me once a year until I was able to drive myself. Then I was able to go all the time. Yeah. Oh God, they hated wrestling. My parents. I don't know what your parents thought of it, but my parents just they know I have to deal with it. My wife doesn't like it either. But so
I mean, it was funny for myself because my mum, she didn't quite understand it.
Mm-hmm.
She appreciated the spectacle of it all.
Right.
Whereas my dad enjoyed it because he would take me to the live events.
Right.
And my dad was the biggest Undertaker fan you would ever meet. He was enamored by his presence. We went to a house show in '96 over here in Birmingham. They didn't announce the card prior. And one of the marquee matches in the end ended up being Undertaker versus Vader. And I still remember to this day, I mean, this was 1996, so we're going back some years. I just remember they were pounding the living hell out of each other. And I turned to my dad and he was like, this isn't a TV show. They're really laying into each other. So my dad understood, it's only a house show, but right. They were still, I mean, obviously being a fan of Vader as I am, I didn't expect any less because obviously Vader was Vader. And, from reading a lot of books and watching a lot of interviews, it's definitely the kid. I was watching one with Bret Hart recently, and he said something very politely along the lines of, when you've finished a match with Vader, you knew you'd been in a match with Vader because you could feel it in the back. So yeah, my dad became a fan through me. Took me to some fantastic live events. He took me to one in 1999 over here in Sheffield. And the main event was Austin versus Rock. This was April 99.
Oh, that's huge. Yeah, that's a huge main event. Yeah.
Well, that was the thing, because as the show was going down, there was no Austin Rock. So we're thinking, maybe they haven't come over for the trip because we've just seen Undertaker versus Ken Shamrock, Triple H versus Kane. It was a hell of a card. And then it dawned on me, even, this was 99, so I was getting up. The main event, I think it's Austin Rock. Rock came out first, and then the glass shatter. It was like, oh my God, we've got Austin Rock as the main event a week after Mania 15. So, yeah, I mean, me and my dad, without going into it, we're not exactly close like we once were, but I will always be thankful for the childhood he gave me, because I got to meet all of these guys, as a fan, watching from the second and third row. And I miss those days as a fan. They were definitely my happiest days as a fan.
Yeah, I feel like I attend more wrestling now as an adult in the last 5 years, especially being involved in the wrestling business.
Sure.
Than I did as a child. And it's just, but I appreciate, not that I don't appreciate what's going on now, especially working in certain wrestling companies, because I do absolutely. I see some amazing talent. I get to call some amazing talent, but there's something special about wrestling. Like me growing up in the 1980s and the early 90s, witnessing some of the guys that would just go on to like superstardom and legends, and
sure,
it's just amazing to me.
Well, I remember at that same live event in '96 in Birmingham, it was a week after The Rock had made his debut at Survivor Series.
Right.
Wearing all the tribal, attire as Rocky Maivia. And even as a child, I didn't believe the character. And I remember I remember telling my dad as well, I don't think this guy's going to last long. How wrong was I?
I think everybody was wrong, to be honest with you. Nobody liked it. They even put the Intercontinental title on him as that, like in that character, all that stuff. And man, I have to say, and me and my friend were discussing this in the car the other night, talking about on our trip to Victory Road, because we were talking about, like, you get to see like a lot of shirts, people wearing the most popular shirts at the time were like Rock, Goldberg, Austin, and there were certain shirts, and we were talking about like how, man, I'm very proud of how I'm one of the few that never wore this, blah 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 blah. But I'm like, no, I had a Rock shirt. No, I'm sorry, guy. Like, he kind of laughed at me. I was like, but it was during his heel run that I owned a Rock shirt that he was like, and I was talking about, I was like, Rock as a heel was like the greatest heel at that time period.
Absolutely.
And it developed him into becoming possibly the biggest babyface in pro wrestling of all time, or one of them at least.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned his heel work. For me as a fan, the moment where I think I truly took notice of The Rock, it was in the build-up to the match with Triple H at SummerSlam, the ladder match in '98.
Yeah.
It was a promo where the nation were in the ring and they had China cornered. And he was coming out with these one-liners about China that were very chauvinistic. If they said it on TV now, they'd get thrown off the air.
We're in a different era, man. Yeah.
Yeah, completely different time. Now, bear in mind, this was '98, so I was only 11 years old. I didn't quite understand everything he was saying, but I knew the meaning somehow, that this was nothing but burying a woman.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, with all due respect, I loved it, because as a fan and as a young kid growing up with a lot of women in my family, there was nothing I wanted more than to tell all these women to shut up in my family. But I couldn't do that because I was 11 years old and I knew my place. So, but yeah, the Rock, there's an old friend of mine who I used to work with, had no idea about wrestling, wasn't interested. He watched one pay-per-view. It was when The Rock came back in 2011 to start the program with. So he watched the episode of Raw when The Rock came back. He became a fan that day, and he's been a fan ever since, to the best of my knowledge. So it just shows you the power and the drawing power that The Rock had. Yeah. And again, as fans, you can't ask for anything more than that, really.
Yeah, it's funny that it's great when you turn people on to wrestling, even today.
Yes.
I invited some friends from work to a show, and they had never been to wrestling before. They've never even watched it, but it was a show I was involved in. They were coming to support. They've been to every show since.
Fantastic.
And so it's just like that first show hooked them. They're like, I've never watched wrestling before. And I'm sitting here like, how old are you? Right? That's usually, I mean, they're a little bit younger than me because they're, I work, I work with like a management position, but it's one of these things. It's like, I'm like, how old are you? Like, you've never watched wrestling before? I was like, I literally thought everybody went through a phase growing up. But then I realized, like, probably in the 2000s, maybe kids didn't. 1980s and the 1990s and the early 2000s, I'd have to say everybody at least goes through a phase. But when somebody didn't go through a phase, I'm just like, man, I found that so bizarre that because growing up in the 80s and early to mid 90s, even in the late 90s, wrestling was literally everywhere, from late night talk shows to morning shows, talk shows like Regis Philbin and stuff like that, to it was literally, you couldn't go anywhere in the mall without seeing like wrestling shirts, like on a kiosk or what have you. So it was, I always thought that was weird, but now these kids are, they come to every show that we put on.
Good. No, that's good. It's I know what you're saying, because over here in the UK, we had a lot of breakfast morning television shows. Yeah. And you get a lot of big time celebrities, the who's who. And then I was, watching it not watching it, but it was in the background at home. Kurt Angle appears on the TV. What is going on? Now, bear in mind, Kurt had I think he was maybe 3 or 4 months into his tenure in WWE.
Right.
So picking everything up. So it's the year 2000. Kurt Angle's on TV wearing the IC and the European Championship. It just didn't make, as a fan, it was brilliant to see, but it was like, wow, this is getting the mainstream. Obviously, it had the mainstream attention in the States, but in the UK, as big as the coverage was, it was never given the respect it deserved. So to see somebody like Kurt Angle, a legit athlete no less, appear on television pushing the WWE, that was TV gold.
Yeah, yeah. So what about independent wrestling in your area? Do you follow a lot of that, or was there a lot in that time period?
Growing up, not really.
Yeah.
There was three. There was the tribute shows, which was filled with the fake Kane, the fake Rock.
Yeah, I've had do you know UK wrestler Johnny Rose at all?
Me and Johnny go way back. I used
Okay.
to ring announce on shows with Johnny. He mentioned he did on your show, yes.
Yeah, I had him on the show before, and he went full blast into explaining all those tribute shows, and I thought it was just fascinating that those type of shows existed.
Do you know what? It was interesting because when I went to one, we had somebody called The Undertaker walk out. Obviously, The Undertaker's nearly 7 feet, tall, wiry. This Undertaker, maybe 5'7", clearly in the day in his life. So even as a child, it was insulting because as a child, you're programmed to expect the real McCoy if you see that on a poster. And then when, the equivalent of Mr. Bean walks through the door, that's the best way. So we had that. We had NWA Hammerlock, which I was a huge fan of. It was the only European-based NWA affiliate at the time.
I remember. Yeah, I remember them. Yeah.
Yeah, they put on some amazing shows, and they created a lot of talent that went on to really lead the next charge in British wrestling, which became the FWA, who were viewed by a lot of fans over here as like the British equivalent of a bit of Ring of Honor, a bit of ECW, splash of WCW. They kind of tried to blend everything together.
And did Ring of Honor do like a combined show with them?
They did, yes. It was their front of honor in May 2003. I mean, if anyone's watching this that haven't seen it, check it out. It was an incredible show.
I had that on VHS back in the day. So
yes, so did I. I couldn't get to it because it was in London, and where I lived in East Yorkshire, it was too far to get to.
Right.
But I made a phone in the VHS. So that's all we really had in terms of local promotion. I mean, if you look at British wrestling now, there's more companies than there's ever been. The scene took quite a hit a few years ago with the Me Too movement speaking out.
That's everywhere. Yeah, that affected us here. There's a lot of people that you just do not hear from. During the pandemic, that whole thing really hit hard. You know what I mean? It was just like a lot of people were just like exposed and or I guess pushed out. And sometimes, I'm not going to say every single person, but it was for the better, for sure. I will tell you that. But I think some of the investigative work wasn't done on some people. That's, I don't know how true.
I mean, as some of the names that were mentioned over here, obviously I'm not going to name those names, but back in my ring announcing days, I announced for a lot of these guys almost on a monthly basis. So I was around them a lot in the locker room. Never saw anything that happened, so I'm never going to give my. But when some of these names came out, I was baffled. I was shocked because you never expect it to come from your own community. I always class wrestling as fans a community and a brotherhood. My passion with the exception of my wife, it sounds cliche, but with the exception of my wife, pro wrestling is my one and only passion. So I take it very seriously and show it the respect it deserves. So when all of this did come out, I couldn't believe it. Some people commented saying, I've seen this and I've seen that. And I was like, you're entitled to make that opinion.
Right.
Came across any of that, but it didn't take away the fact that the whole thing was just a complete bombshell to everyone. So a lot of the British scene kind of took a downturn for maybe a year and a half. I think it's only in the last 18 months it's really clawed its way back up. There's a lot of talent that at some of our local British shows, you can tell they've got it. They just need that. It's like yourself on the shows you work on. They have They're just waiting for that opportunity. Some of these guys are grabbing the opportunity, and some of them are not for whatever reasons. But no, the British scene is definitely back on the up and up, and it's good to see, because if NXT Europe does finally launch, which has been spoken about for so long now,
if it does, we'll see.
If it launches, this will be great for these guys, because it'll give them somewhere to go to hone their skills. But if not, AEW have finally made their presence over here now, but New Japan come over here. New Japan will be here next month, in fact, for a big show.
Oh, nice.
So, so the opportunities now for the British scene are probably better than they've ever been. And it's fantastic to see, because some of the British guys that I got to announce went on to WWE NXT UK and had the spotlight shown on them there. So, I mean, the shows I did were in front of 30 people. So to some people, that's called nothing. To me, I had a right. Those small crowds, they appreciated what you gave them. And it was a learning curve, because a lot of these guys developed their characters. And then when they went on to WWE NXT UK and beyond, I would never say I had a hand in that, because I didn't. But I like to feel I was maybe 0.5% of what led them in terms of developing their character. Because at the beginning of shows, I was always a big fan of Todd Pettingill and his countdown shows for WWE. So before we did a show, I would always do a pre-show. The bookers and the owners, they didn't tell me to do it. I took it upon myself to do it, to try and get the show over, get the storylines over for those who weren't there the month before, because we always ran the same. And I would always say to guys, if you've got 2 minutes, can we do an interview for the DVD? It got to the point where it became so popular, some of these guys came up to me and said, Dave, are we doing an interview for the DVD? So little things like that. I do miss doing the ring announcing. I'm happy that I'm not doing it anymore, because my time isn't as free as it once was. But it was good times, because watching some of those guys go on to become bigger names, it was just a pleasure to be a part of. It really was.
Yeah. How did you get involved in doing that?
It was purely by chance. I went to there was a British show over here, and a friend of mine who was working on the show as security said, I know a guy. He runs a bunch of shows. He needs a ring announcer. He knew I'd wanted to get into ring announcing for years and years, because Howard Finkel, God rest his soul, was my guy. I mean, I was a Gary Michael Capetta fan as well. But
love that guy.
Yeah, great guy, right? Howard Finkel was my guy, so I wanted to do that. I went up to this guy who was called Brad, and I said, I've been told you need a ring announcer. I've not done it before, but if you need someone, I'm not asking for any money, because I'm no one. I just want the opportunity. Yeah, come down. We did the show. The microphone for the live event wouldn't work until the main event. So for the entire time working without a mic, because I was on the road to paying my dues that night, for sure. Went down a storm, and then at the end of the night, he said to me, you're my guy from now on. Yes, sir. Tell me where you need to be. And the irony of it all is, the town where I did those early shows, I actually now live in that town, because that's where my wife's from. So it's really strange how it's all worked out. But that's how I got into it. And then on my second ever show, I wrote about this in a previous issue of Wrestling Fan News. Tracy Smothers was booked for the card. And the owner, Brad, said, we've got Tracy Smothers. I had no idea. It was a last-minute addition, because he was in the UK touring. And he said, when you're in the ring, we're going to open the show. You're going to hand him a Lifetime Achievement Award. So bear in mind, this is my second show as an announcer. I went to pieces before the show. I just went to pieces. And I went up to Tracy and I was like, look, Mr. Smothers, my second show. I'm not saying I need help. I'm not saying guide me. Just whatever you need me to do, you tell me. And like the grizzled pro that I expected, he just said, don't worry about it, kid. We'll call it when we're in the ring. Okay, sir, I'll follow. And the footage is available on YouTube. And if you look back, you can see he's leading me through that whole moment.
Yeah.
When we went backstage, ironically, it was Johnny Rose, who was the guy who wrestled Tracy that night. That's how I came to know Johnny. And then when we got through to the locker room afterwards, I went up to him and just said, thank you, sir. And put his fist out with fist bumps. And he said, good job, kid. My second show, I worked with Tracy Smothers. Definitely the highlight of my ring announcing career. It was very humbling experience.
He's a huge Tracy Smothers fan, Johnny.
Tracy and Johnny got to know each other pretty
Yeah.
well. There were a lot of shows together. Johnny, I mean this respectfully, and Johnny will probably agree when I say Johnny stole a lot of stuff from Tracy, but one man's the man's borrow, right? I know Johnny and Tracy become quite tight, and I know when Tracy unfortunately passed, that hit Johnny hard. That hit him really hard.
Yeah, I know. It hit a lot of people. I was honestly quite shocked, and Tracy was one of the great professional wrestlers that I don't think that really get like superstardom. He had his time in WWE, WCW, etc., but it wasn't like a lot of times he was kind of like a gimmick in a lot of those places. You know what I mean? But
yeah, I remember watching Superstars, and he came out as Freddie Floyd, and I was like, "This is Tracy Smothers. What are you doing?" Even as a kid, I knew that this wasn't the right thing, you know.
Eventually, he changed his name back on the show. I remember, but he was doing like enhancement work mostly at the time.
Yeah.
So, did you ever see? No, we're talking about British wrestling and stuff. Did you ever see the documentary Two Falls to a Finish?
Yes, I did.
That's I got that DVD a couple years back, and that opened me up to a lot. Like I didn't know a whole lot about it, British wrestling, but that opened me up to a lot more. You know what I mean? I had some DVDs of guys like Regal, early days, and some videos, and I go on YouTube every now and again. But that documentary, man, that's a lot of fun. I think
it was. I think it gave a lot of wrestling fans over here who were purely American wrestling fans.
Yeah,
it gave them a new appreciation for wrestling in their own country.
Yeah,
because British wrestling scene, as a Brit and a huge fan of wrestling, I think the British style of wrestling is probably, again, just my opinion, probably the most influential style of wrestling because it crosses, how can I put this? It kind of jumps in between each style. The British and Japanese style work so well together. The British and the Mexican style. We had guys over here in the early noughties, Johnny Storm, Jody Fleisch.
right.
They were building that style together. And some of the stuff they were doing was unbelievable. Their matches they had were human highlight reels because they had the high spots and then they blended the British style perfectly. So, no, that documentary opened a lot of eyes for fans either side of the Atlantic and definitely gave them a new insight into British wrestling. It was quite sad at times to watch. It pulled on your heartstrings, so to speak. It didn't hold back. And I think that's the reason it did so well, because it pulled no punches and it really delved into British wrestling.
Yeah. British wrestling is very influential in a lot of modern wrestling, I believe. Like, as far as like technical level, it seems like there's definitely a huge audience for like technical wrestling, and British wrestling, I think, like really has a big part in that. Guys like Billy Robinson and like you mentioned, like I'm trying to remember who else, like Johnny Saint and guys like that.
Johnny Saint, Johnny Kidd, these guys, Tony St. Clair. There was a guy called Alan Kilby. Wasn't quite as revered as the Johnny Saints and Johnny Kidds, but my God, the stuff the guy could do in the ring. He was tying people into knots, making them look like pretzels. It was a pure art form. I know Bryan Danielson credits his time in the UK working the camps as probably the most pivotal moment of his career, because I remember there was a local show over here in the UK on the coast. Dragon turned up as a surprise, but he was wearing a mask. So for all the kids who weren't aware of that, they were loving this. Like, wow, we've got a masked guy here. For all of the so-called smart fans of the time, all we got all evening was a chance of take your mask off. And it was so frustrating because you could tell Dragon was getting bothered by this.
Yeah.
And in the end, I remember turning to a guy saying, look, we get it. You're used to seeing him without a mask on. Just enjoy the show for what it's worth. He's not going to take the mask off. You know it is. Don't let the mask define his ability in the ring. We know he's going to put on the best match of the night. And he did. So
his earliest days, he was wearing the mask when he was wrestling in Texas under, training under Shawn Michaels. If you remember, he was just a skinny little kid in a mask.
Yes. I remember getting a best of the American Indies tape. And one of the matches on that was from the TWA in Texas.
Yeah.
And it was Danielson in a mask. versus Spanky, Brian Kendrick.
Yes. Yep.
I had no idea who these guys were, but the match blew my mind. So when they ended up in Ring of Honor maybe a year and a half later, I was like, oh my God, that's the guys from TWA. And, you know, to this day, I've been a Danielson fan. One of my favourite matches I ever saw live was Danielson McGuinness, Ring of Honor Liverpool, when they unified the World and Pure titles. It was a scary match. You watch it back, some of the stuff they were doing was terrifying, but yeah, great game.
It's amazing to see. Like, I love that TWA stuff, and to see that Danielson becoming one of the biggest professional wrestlers of all time is just awesome. I think, you know,
as a fan growing up, I always thought Lance Cade was destined for major things. It was such a tragedy when when he passed away, because I remember at one time when I was having the Shawn Michaels Jericho feud, I thought they were finally going to pull the plug on Lance. It's a shame it never panned out, because when he teamed with Trevor Murdoch, that was such a throwback for me.
They were a great tag team. Yeah,
they were, weren't they? They were so good. So no, it's a shame that Lance never became the star that I think a lot of people thought he was going to be.
You ever hear Trevor Murdoch talk about working WWE? Like, he didn't expect to get hired by there because he didn't have the look, but it was because he was trained by Harley Race that he got the offer, and his run there wasn't that long, to be honest with you, if you look at it.
I remember watching, again, it was the Best of the Indies tape, and it was from Harley's promotion / school at the time.
WLW, yeah.
That's the one, and he was wrestling Trevor Rhodes. I remember thinking, like, oh, is this a Rhodes I've not heard of? Fantastic. Because he sure as hell wrestled like a Rhodes, you know. I can't remember who he was working in that match. Honestly, no, I can't remember that. But when I saw him in WWE with Lance Cade, because I'm such a fan of the old school style NWA wrestling, this was a match made in heaven for me. So I was all over that. It was fantastic.
Yeah. You recently attended some show that was considered to be the biggest show in the history of professional wrestling. Not one of the most influential, I'd have to say as well. And AEW's All In. Would you tell us about your experience attending that show? I watched it between 2 days. You know, so it aired on Sunday. I probably watched half on Sunday, half on Monday. So what I for the most part enjoyed it. I'm not the world's biggest AEW fan, but you know, I could sit here and tell you what's wrong with every part of it, but I'm not going to do that. I try to promote positivity here.
It was an incredible experience, the spectacle of it. Up until that point, the biggest show I'd ever attended was maybe 15, 16,000 people.
Okay.
So I'd never been to a stadium show. I honestly didn't know what to expect. The atmosphere outside of the stadium was unlike anything I've ever experienced. My wife was there with me. It was a last minute switch. I was meant to go with my brother-in-law, who was a major fan, member of the WFIA. He came down ill. So my wife joined me at the last minute. And even she, who is only a very casual fan, couldn't help being taken aback by the atmosphere. There were fans from all over Europe, and I'm pretty sure I heard some American accents as well that had come over. So we made our way into the stadium, and when we walked in, the setup, it was unlike anything I'd ever been a part of. I had goosebumps. I'm thinking, I'm part of history here. As a wrestling fan attending a live show, this is probably going to be the zenith for me for a long time.
Yeah.
The show began. The opening match of the night, you know, people have watched it, was Samoa Joe CM Punk.
Mm-hmm.
Joe got an incredible reaction. And I remember turning to my wife saying, this Punk reaction is going to be very interesting.
Yeah.
From where I was sat in the stadium, I would say they were 70-30 against Punk.
Really?
Yes, from where I was sat, purely from my side of the stadium, it felt like there were more Joe fans than Punk. As the match went on, I think that changed a bit because people have their opinions on CM Punk. In a big match setting, you can't deny what he brings to the table.
Right.
So they had what I thought was a very good match by their standard of, they were never going to get back to those heights in their Ring of Honor days. At least that's what most fans thought anyway. But I think they put on a hell of an opening match. It definitely set the tone nicely for the show. And as the show progressed, the fans were getting louder. And I've never been a part of that before. I've been in shows where the crowd have burned out after the fourth and fifth match of the card. They were getting louder and louder. And then when Jericho came out for his match with Ospreay, when he did he channeled his inner Freddie Mercury before performing with Fozzy, that was one of the highlights for me, because getting to join in with Jericho, doing this Freddie Mercury, hey, yo, it was fantastic. It was absolutely incredible. I'm a huge FTR fan, So the match with the Bucks, for me, I was glued to my seat. It was just, and again, as the show went on, the Stadium Stampede was absolute insanity. I've never been a part of a match like that before. I've watched more insane matches, obviously, we all have, but to be a part of that live, it was just utter insanity. One thing I'll take from it is, by the end of the night, when the final bell rang, bear in mind the pre-show was 2 hours. There's a lot of the stuff that happened in the 0 hour that wasn't put on the 0 hour. So there's a lot of stuff that went down, interviews and such. So if you think about it, it was about a 6-hour show.
Jesus. Wow.
A lot of seats in Wembley Stadium are not comfortable. Anyone going to Wembley Stadium, take a pillow for your backside, because they are comfortable seats. By the end of the night, when the final bell rung after the main event, the crowd were at their loudest. It was unbelievable. The crowd had stuck with this all night, so it made the atmosphere just that bit more electric. And then, for me, the other thing I'll take from the show was the camaraderie between the fans. Everyone was there to have a good time. British wrestling fans, some British shows, you can go to a show and 2 matches into it, they're drunk, they're fighting, they're getting thrown. I went to a Ring of Honor show when Ring of Honor came over here in 2018. There was a guy at ringside who was drunk from the opening bell, and he made a point of making his voice heard throughout the show, to the point where Christopher Daniels acknowledged this and stopped and said, "They've paid to see us, not hear you." And it got the loudest pop of the night. The other thing from All In was when we're coming out and we're heading home, it was when the news of CM Punk and Jack Perry's altercation broke.
Yeah.
And it's crazy to think this, but people became even more alert when they heard this news. You think they were going to start coming down from it, the adrenaline drop, maybe falling asleep? No, they were wide awake and wired. It was the talk of the area. So, I mean, obviously I digress, but overall, the experience of All In was phenomenal. Probably from a spectacle point of view, it was the greatest live event I've ever attended. Seeing Sting live, if I never watch a wrestling match ever again, I will be a happy man knowing I got to see Sting live. I was lucky to see it one time for an independent show, but I got to see Sting the second time. I'm very grateful and humbled that I got to see Sting live. And if anyone's watching this from the UK, if you didn't get to All In, make a point of getting there next year, because they put 81,000 people in there. You know they're going to try and top that next year. So
I'm going to try for at least 100. So
I mean, I think the capacity for Wembley is around 90,000.
Oh, it's 90,000. That's not including cockroaches and
no, it's around 90.
Staff. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think they can do it. I really do. If they keep I think if AEW came back to the UK between that, maybe taped an episode of Dynamite Collision, that would keep the momentum going. Because if they leave it a year to come back over here, I actually think they'll lose momentum. That's just my opinion.
It's very possible. Yeah. Yeah. So my question is, you mentioned the gentleman. It's got a lot of news on his back as of late in CM Punk.
Yes.
I am one that I don't necessarily care about hearing that. I don't know how much of it is. I don't, and it's like, it's not that I don't care. I think a lot of it is forced in a way that me and one of my co-hosts that does the dailies, weekly shows rather, we were talking about this, and I felt like he sort of had a target on his back in a way, that he's not accepted because he's not one of these. I want to say this right without sounding like an idiot, but he tried to offer his knowledge, his experience, and yada yada. And these guys don't want to necessarily listen to him because they think, oh, I'm currently huge in Japan, or 5 years ago, huge in Japan. It's IWGP champion, IWGP tag team champions, blah 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 blah. I'm just saying that out of all this bullshit that's happened in the last year, it's been a year probably, right, since everything started. I'm still, and I'm not the world's biggest CM Punk fan. I am wearing a shirt now, so I do have to say I am Team Punk on this. I happen to agree with him. Maybe he's just trying to offer his experience, veteran type experience, trying to help these guys build a promotion that's going to last, and frankly, trying to help these guys get over without necessarily even killing themselves and have longer careers, etc., etc. And a lot of these guys just aren't willing to accept it, i.e., Jack Perry, for one, the Young Bucks. And I don't know about Kenny Omega. I still think Kenny Omega is probably one of the greatest professional wrestlers today. A lot of people don't like him, such as a guy that we might know by the name of Jim Cornette, who always rags on him on his podcast, but I'm just like, that's a lot of stuff he did in his early career. Like the last, the guy is still one of the best professional wrestlers in the world. I'm not going to deny that. I agree with 98% of what Cornette says involving professional wrestling. However, there's very little that I disagree with, but I don't know if you agree with me on what the whole Punk situation is, but
I think with me, CM Punk, I'm a CM Punk fan. I doubt it I ever will be. However, when he signed with AEW, I genuinely believed that this was going to be a big turning point in wrestling. Because, like or not, to quote Tony Schiavone, the guy puts butts in the seats. Whether you like the guy, is one of the few legit main event draws left outside of WWE. So when you think of that just on its own, there isn't many people like that who are active at work. I was discussing this with my wife when it all happened. I'm comparing the CM Punk exit to when WWE did the invasion angle. In the sense of, for WWE, it was viewed as their biggest missed opportunity ever. I think in 10, 20 years' time, we're going to look back at this and think for AEW, this was their biggest opportunity ever. So much money left on the table.
If AEW exists in 20 years.
There's a lot of skeptics thinking they're not going to last the next 5 years, and fair enough. People said that about TNA, and they're still hanging in there.
It's been over 20 years now, right? Yeah, and they're just celebrating their 1,000th episode this coming week. So, at the time of this recording, I'm just going to say so.
So I think, again, I was never the biggest fan of Punk, but I respected what he brought to wrestling.
Yeah.
His feud with MJF, it was very polarizing for people I know. I personally thought their dog collar match was outstanding.
Yeah.
Probably my favorite Punk match ever. And there's not many of them, again, because I'm not a fan. But the match with MJF I thought was outstanding. I think if they could have put everything on, they should have locked them all in a room, because we all know Vince McMahon would not have put up with this.
Absolutely.
He'd have been like, "You're fired, pal." He'd have been out the door. If they could have worked out their differences, if you take out the Elite and the FTR out of the equation, if you look purely at Punk and Omega, that is a feud that could have drawn huge money, could have lasted potentially for years, as long as men's bodies held up. And then when you interweave the Young Bucks, FTR, when you bring Hangman Page back into the equation, the drama, you could have put MJF into that. You could have included the Blackpool Combat Club because of what happened. All of these interweaving threads If Paul Heyman had been in charge of this, he'd have had a field day, because if anyone could interweave threads of a storyline, I always thought it was Paul Heyman. So I think it'll be viewed as a missed opportunity. Jack Perry, I've read a lot about this, and when we had a wrestling convention over here in April for the love of wrestling, which I attended. I will be there next year with a WFIA booth to promote the company, so I can't wait for that.
Oh, we're going to talk about WFIA in just a short minute. Yep.
Apparently, Jack Perry came across as very unapproachable, ignorant, one-worded responses in the Q&A. I think a lot of people saw the writing on the wall then. And then when I watched the pre-show back, when we got back from Wembley, and the spot with Hook when he slapped the glass and said, "This is real glass, cry me a river." I remember thinking, that is the equivalent of a child who has just had his favourite toy taken from him and thrown in the bin. So I don't agree much with Eric Bischoff these days, but when Bischoff said, I would fire Jungle Boy, fire him. As my opinion as a fan, cut him loose and just, yeah. But I think AEW, I mentioned this in a quote, if ever there was a time for them now to rebuild and build their momentum back up, this is it. It's just whether it'll happen or not.
I'm surprised that both men didn't get fired, that it was just Punk that got fired, to be honest with you.
Yes, I expected Perry to follow. So when it said that they just terminated Punk, maybe there's something else about Perry that's happened and we don't know about. Who knows? But if and when Perry does return to AEW, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens.
And I'm not against him being pushed, because I do think he's a very exceptional talent.
Yes.
For being such a young kid, and and I think he's really good. It's just he doesn't need to have an attitude this young in his career. He's still relatively young in his career, because when he got signed with AEW, he was only a couple years in, maybe.
Yes, 2 years maybe.
Yeah.
He's not even close to hitting his prime yet. His best years, are so many years ahead of him.
Right.
So it would be great to see him work something out, because when people say he's not a star yet, he's very much a star in the making.
Yeah.
I still think that he could, in however many years, be one of the flag bearers for the company. They didn't call him a pillar for nothing. That's all that's the best way I can describe it.
So let's talk a little bit about the WFIA, the Wrestling Fans International Association. I got that right. Yes. It's hard to say sometimes, like,
it
get confused. We are both members of the board. We are both members of the WFIA, and we are both contributors to the newsletter Wrestling Fan News, which I have a fun time doing. We both submit quite a bit. So what's your when did you join? You joined it recently got relaunched earlier this year. I believe Brad Drake was telling me, right?
It did, yes. So I got acquainted with Brad via Wrestler Steve Stone on Facebook for our love of wrestling autobiographies. So we connected through that. And then one morning back in March, I got a PM on Facebook from Mr. Drake saying, I'm bringing back the WFIA. I'd heard of the WFIA, but had no real knowledge of its history. It was only through autobiographies that I knew of its existence. And he said he wanted me on board as the UK representative, and I was extremely overwhelmed and humbled by that. And I said, yes, sir, count me in. Whatever you want me to do, I'll be a part of that. And then he gave an outline of what he hoped to achieve with the WFIA. It's the type of thing as a kid that I wanted to be a part of. So now as a grown adult with so much respect for this wonderful sport, it was a pleasure to be invited, and I've had such an amazing experience. We got acquainted through it. I got to meet Mr. Basinski, who, after reading the Sheik's autobiography, I had no idea this man contributed as much to the Sheik's career as he did. So that was a wonderful read, and knowing that he's part of this. And the WFI, it's been great to see its growth in such a short time. The members that are joining, the interaction on social media that we're having with it. I think the sky's the limit for the WFIA. And when I go to this convention next March and have a table, I am going to plug the you-know-what out of it, because it's going to be something a lot of UK members join. I'm trying everything to raise UK awareness, and I'm getting there slowly but surely. John, what you can as well. So, no, the WFIA, if anybody's watching this is not a part of it, please go to the WFIA.org, sign up for free. You can contribute to the newsletter once you're a member. And like you say with the Wrestling Fan News, as somebody who loves wrestling print and has a subscription to a British wrestling magazine, to be a part of that is a fantastic experience, and it's something I know we all enjoy being a part of. It's an exciting time to be involved.
Yeah. Obviously, anybody that listens is maybe sick of hearing the ad, but I play it at the beginning of every single episode and sometimes towards the end. And the link is in every description of every episode. So I want everybody to go to WFIA.org, sign up. It's free. You get the free bi-monthly newsletter. You get to see David and I's names in print. We can contribute. I always contribute the Northeast results. I contribute interviews that I've done. It's just a blast being able to contribute to a newsletter that other people are reading. It's a blast, because I have some older issues laying in my collection. I got boxes and boxes of wrestling magazines from the 60s, 70s, 80s sitting here besides me, and I always pull them out. They're fun to go through. I always just but the WFIA, the WFN newsletter, I love contributing to it. I've always I used to contribute some here and there newsletters, results. I'd send them in, and once in a while they'd be posted, yada yada. But now to have a somewhat more important role in this is very exciting for us as adults, I guess you could say.
Absolutely. Growing up in the UK, we had a magazine called Power Slam, which was so popular. I used to write in a lot to this for the Q&A session because this was in the infancy of the internet. So we couldn't get the access to wrestling news back in the early 90s, late 90s that we can now. So Power Slam was a way for British fans to know what was happening in WCW, ECW, Japan, Mexico, Germany. So, and I do own a lot of those issues, so I get to look back on those and read them and appreciate them. And then when you flash forward to 2023 and we look at WFN and see our names in there, the inner child, the inner Mark, whatever you want to call it, just beams pride because we know we are a small part of something a lot bigger, and it's only going to get bigger.
Like I said, it's only been since earlier this year it reignited. So we're only a few months in. But yes. Brad is doing an amazing job as our leader.
Absolutely.
We get to sit there in Zoom meetings once a month or what have you with guys like George Shire. Tom Burke, the legendary Tom Burke, who I know personally, is a contributor, a special advisor who's just his wealth of knowledge. I've run into him like 3 times this year at conventions and wrestling shows. One that I was a part of, he attended, and seeing his face is always very exciting because he's possibly the nicest human being on the face of this earth. I'll tell you that much. And he knows a hell of a lot about wrestling. If you ever get a chance to visit his shrine in Springfield, Massachusetts,
I'd love to.
I mean, I've been up there. I think it was earlier this year I went, and I got to tell you, man, I was amazed. Like my eyes popped open when I walked in that room, and you just saw pictures, autographed pictures along the wall of guys from like the 50s and 60s, and I'm just like in amazement at what was going on.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I know Brian, Mr. Brian Ferguson. Yeah. I remember the first time I was in a Zoom meeting with him, and I noticed along his back wall in his office a lot of posters from a lot of guys from like the Florida days and the Crockett days. It was like, oh my gosh, just to see those on the wall.
Yeah.
Not that he loves, respects, and appreciates just the lineage of this business, this sport rather. As a fan at 36, I turned 36 recently, so I'm officially on the road to 40 now. As a fan at my age of 36 in the UK, how can I put this? I'm not trying to sound big-headed when I say I have great pride in the fact that my knowledge of wrestling goes far beyond WWE, AEW, because in the UK, unless you're a diehard, that's all you know. Yeah. I try and absorb as much wrestling. For example, I recently purchased a book, which I've just started, about the history of pro wrestling in the Bahamas at Nassau Stadium.
Really?
Ian Douglas wrote this. He was the chap who has contributed to a lot of books. Steve Cairns being one of them. I can't wait to delve into this because all of the greats have competed there. So I can't wait to read this. So it'll be another piece of the puzzle, so to speak, for me.
That's amazing. I want, if you can, and when we're done here, I want DM me that information because I want to on that book because I know the Kern one just recently was released, and I heard him recently on Dave Dynasty's podcast, which was an amazing interview. We were just talking about Brian Ferguson. He's got an amazing podcast as well, Bumps and Thumps.
Indeed,
which is that is now he puts out a weekly podcast, which is available everywhere. I want everybody to go check that out. And he has some really interesting guests. And the fun part about professional wrestling is in podcasts, etc., is hearing everybody's opinions or anybody's version of professional wrestling from where they live. And I believe he lives in the Midwest, if I'm not mistaken. So he's always got something, a lot of guests from his area on there. And that's the thing I loved about professional wrestling. I love the territories and I love the regional stuff. So hearing or being introduced to, sometimes he has indie guys currently from his area on. It's always very interesting to hear stuff, their stories and discovering things. So, I really like that show a lot.
Yeah, it's he's almost a credit to his territory, so to speak, as well, because as a wrestling fan who's obsessed with the history of pro wrestling in the States, I've always felt like the Midwest is an underappreciated, overlooked territory. People talk about Florida, the Carolinas, New York, Detroit, with the Sheik in the days of Cobo Hall. But the Midwest, so much has come out of that area, and it's still coming out of that area. And the fans, I remember watching a Mick Foley interview. I say I'm not a big fan of him, but I remember watching an interview saying they hated me as Mankind, but when I'd walk to the ring as Dude Love, they gave me the biggest pops I'd ever received, which is madness when you think about it.
It's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, so, it's great. I know recently he had Brett Sawyer on there, who, we lost only a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
Which was a shocker because after hearing him talk, he sounded like he was doing well in good health, but it's one of those things, isn't it?
Well, here's a little tidbit. I was a couple months back, we were trying to get hooked up when we were actually sitting in there, and we were having some technical difficulties, and it's unfortunate that an interview never happened, as he was supposed to be a guest on here. And then we were supposed to reschedule and all this other stuff, but I think that there was just a lot of time issues on both parts and to find out he had passed, I was very saddened because I had somewhat kept in touch with him, I should say, on a regular basis and spoke with him. And so the fact that, to hear such sad news suddenly, it was just awful. I got to tell you. And I felt really bad that I really wish that we could have got that interview done because it would have just been a nice piece. And I don't know how much I probably would have even felt even more awful if we actually had that interview. So, you know what I mean?
Yes, no, it was a huge loss, to, how can I put this? To casual fans, they probably won't know the name of Brett Sawyer.
Yeah.
But having seen a lot of footage of him primarily on YouTube and a couple of old VHS tapes, we've lost another brother of our community, and we're losing too many of them.
It's been a rough couple months. Like, we've been losing people on a somewhat weekly basis, it seems.
It is. It's we're losing too many greats who have impacted the sport worldwide. But their contributions, will always do what we can as fans to keep their legacy alive.
Yeah. There is a lot of footage of him out there. I was a big fan of his growing up younger. Obviously the younger brother of Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer, who in itself was a legend and died way too young. I'll tell you that much. So
yes, I think Buzz Sawyer is one of the greatest heels of all time.
Yeah.
The heat he drew from the fans was incredible.
Yeah, and don't forget his feud with Tommy Rich was,
of course,
absolutely amazing. And I'm a huge Tommy Rich fan as well. So that match got me real good.
Good.
So I want to thank you for coming on, spending the last hour and change with me. I appreciate you coming on. Why don't you tell our listeners where you can be reached?
Sure. So I am available through the WFIA, so you can reach me via that platform. I do have an email address if you want to be a part of the membership committee, which I've had a lot of ups and downs with this, trying to get this rocking and rolling, stage some meetings. But if you want to get in touch with me, you can do. My details are on the website, but if you want to make a note of them now, it would be Davey, so that's DAVEYLH at hotmail.co.uk. You can hit me up on Facebook, David Harold. You'll see a picture of myself and my wife in the background, so you'll know it's me. Very proud of that picture. And if any British fans are watching this, the For the Love of Wrestling convention takes place over here next March. I will be there with a table promoting the WFIA. If you want to be a part of that in any way, please get in touch. The more we can spread the word, the better. And like I always say in a lot of posts I watch, keep supporting pro wrestling and support the WFIA.
Thank you very much. And don't forget the WFIA.org. Go. All you got to do is enter your email address, click submit. Nothing else. There's no credit cards. There's nothing. You don't have to purchase anything. However, they do have t-shirts and all that other stuff for your purchase. I got mine. I wear mine proudly. I wore mine to the New England Fan Fest to make sure that I told everybody about it. You can do the same. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. Dave, thank you so much.
Pleasure is all mine.
Platforms. It's professional wrestling's greatest, largest, privately owned wrestling library. All the classic hits, flips, slams, and pins of yesteryear are on one place. It's Ultimate Classic Wrestling. Check out the Nature Boy Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Mr. USA Tony Atlas, Tito Santana, Rick Martel, a who's who of professional wrestling's greatest spotlight stars ever to grace the squared circle, all in one place. Grab the best seat in the house for memories and mayhem on Ultimate Classic Wrestling.
Hi, this is Bob Smith. You might remember me from my years at Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine. Well, now I've started a brand new podcast called The Outdated Wrestling Hour. Yes, we're going to take a whimsical look back at the wrestling figures, stars, and trends from years gone by. We're talking 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and a whole lot more. There's going to be laughs. There's going to be fun. There's going to be action. You name it. Please tune in for the Outdated Wrestling Hour wherever you get your podcasts.